At the edge of the mythic north, gods roamed freely between forms: wolf, raven, woman, mare. Their bodies were not prisons, but permissions. Loki, trickster and shapeshifter, birthed an 8-legged horse with blood still steaming under his belly. He had become a stallion, seduced a giant's beast, and returned divine. The Norse cheered. No one flinched. No one asked why their gods could cross boundaries that would cost mortal men everything. In longhouses thick with smoke and story, bards recited sagas of Odin donning women's robes to summon hidden powers. Listeners nodded with reverence, drinking in tales of divine transformation. But if a man in that same hall wore a skirt, not in jest, but in truth, he would not be revered. He would be erased. The contradiction wasn't hypocrisy. It was policy. What elevated the divine destroyed the human. The same act, filtered through hierarchy, reversed its meaning. Gods transformed and were worshipped. Men transformed and were hunted. Viking society built no word for love between men. That absence was a weapon, not a gap. Language didn't describe, it controlled. What could not be spoken could not be defended. What lacked a name lacked protection, but the system didn't need bans. It needed shadows. Silence became law. The law did not forbid sex between men. It dissected the act by position. To give was power, to receive was ruin. One preserved masculine identity. The other crossed into a realm the law called unman. Words existed for this crossing: arger, ergi, sword-in, not slurs, sentences. To be called sword-in, sexually used, made passive, was not insult. It was a blade. It meant you had been undone, not by failure, but by your body's reception. Masculinity wasn't something you owned. It was something you proved endlessly, in gesture and in war. And something that could be taken from you in a single night, a single rumor, a single word. This was a system, ancient, durable, cold. The gods galloped across the sky on Sleipnir, 8-legged and unburdened. Below, men moved carefully through frozen fields, terrified that one misstep, one softened glance, one silence too long, could mark them forever. The runestone rose from the center of the village like a silent scream in granite. Fresh chisel marks spelled a single word: arger. No trial, no testimony, just stone and meaning, hard, sharp, irrevocable. In Viking society, to be branded arger was worse than death. Fire might scar flesh. That word incinerated identity. It didn't accuse, it condemned. Not just what a man did, but what he was allowed to be. Honor wasn't virtue, it was structure. A house built brick by brick from raids survived, sons born, enemies bested. But a single accusation could collapse it all, leaving no foundation to rebuild. The fortress of a man's name could not survive the whisper that he had knelt in the wrong context. The Gragas, Iceland's great legal code, codified this truth in ink and blood. If someone called you sword-in, it didn't matter if it was true. It didn't matter if it was witnessed. The law required only one thing: that you kill him or die trying. There was no appeal, no testimony. The insult was injury. Words didn't describe, they wounded, and wounds cried for red. This wasn't justice, this was equilibrium. You didn't defend your innocence. You defended the very idea that you still counted as a man. And if you failed, if you hesitated, if you even paused too long to draw your sword, the system declared you guilty not because of what you had done, but because of what you had not killed. And the one who made you arger, he walked free if you didn't stop him. So men learned to slash quickly, to cut silence before it bloomed. They didn't wait for proof. They bled before they thought. The system taught them this wasn't violence, it was repair. Some called it honor, others knew it was machinery, precision-built, unforgiving. designed not to protect men, but to discipline them into roles so narrow that even a glance could collapse them. That stone, that word, arger, was not just a marker of shame. It was an executioner with no sword, only memory. And in the mornings, when frost veiled the carving, it still pulsed beneath the ice. The man it named still walked the village paths, still carried water, still chopped wood, still breathed. But the village didn't see him, because the system had already made him disappear. He sat cross-legged in the dirt outside the assembly hall, spine straight, hands resting carefully on his knees, not clenched, not limp. A posture carved for survival, not defiance, not surrender, just stillness sharp enough to bleed. 3 days had passed since the word Sordin was thrown like a spear through his name. No one had seen an act, no body had been caught. There was no evidence because none was needed. In Viking society, words weren't claims, they were weapons, and once spoken aloud, they became real. The sun stretched long over the frost-bitten roofs. He didn't move, didn't speak. The villagers passed without acknowledgement, performing the silence that kept them safe. Children were pulled away if they wandered too close, too curious. They would learn early what happened when a man's body crossed an invisible line. No stories warned them, the stories weren't needed. The consequences taught faster. His accuser had claimed that during a raid, this man had been taken. Not beaten, not broken. Used. That one word didn't bruise skin. It inverted identity. He hadn't just failed to fight back. The accusation meant he hadn't even counted as a man in that moment. And now he wasn't one. Under Gragas, he had the right to challenge the speaker to single combat. That was the law's promise. But the law lied. To reclaim his name, he needed the masculine credibility that the accusation had already stripped away. A duel with a man marked as passive wasn't justice, it was comedy. Victory would prove nothing. Defeat would confirm everything. He was caught in the trap of a system that created shame, then made it impossible to undo. His voice was gone, not by gag, but by subtraction. The people no longer heard him, the law no longer saw him. His body still lived, but his status had died. Around him the village carried on. Women drew water, their chatter fading when they passed. Merchants haggled louder, overcompensating with laughter that pretended not to notice him. His wife hadn't spoken since the accusation, not from anger, but from necessity. To touch his disgrace was to risk contagion. Reputation was bloodborne, it passed through proximity. So he sat, not exiled, not accepted, a man in limbo, trapped between social life and social death, still useful for labor, still denied the dignity of belonging. And when night fell, the darkness did not cover him, it completed him. The ship rocked gently on dark water, but the stillness on its deck was absolute. Seawater mixed with blood, soaking the planks, where victory had already dried into ritual. The raid was over, the silver was counted, the weapons stacked. But the true prize stood trembling in the ship's center. The captured chieftain, once the voice of law, now stripped of everything but his breathing. His cloak had been torn away, not for spoils, for spectacle. Naked under northern sky, he stood not as a man, but as a lesson. The Vikings weren't just looters, they were engineers of humiliation. What they destroyed wasn't only villages, it was structure, order, identity. This was not random cruelty, it was curriculum. The chieftain was bound, not to prevent escape, but to pose him correctly. Wrists tight, shoulders exposed, spine straightened not in pride, but in preparation. His status had once protected others. Now it served his own annihilation. The raiding captain watched the degradation unfold with cold precision, no laughter, no thrill. Just calculation, Sexual violence wasn't excess, it was doctrine, a method, a message. To break a leader was to shatter leadership itself. The crew surrounded the scene like priests at an altar. This was sacrament, not indulgence. The man's suffering was theater, and the audience learned. Witnesses absorbed the choreography of conquest, what it looked like to undo a man not with blades, but with reversal. Masculinity was hierarchy. The raid turned it inside out. The wind howled across the sea, but the loudest thing was the silence of the chieftain. He didn't cry out. That would have offered closure. He only gasped, shallow and slow, each breath carving deeper into his unmaking. His captors saw his emptiness as proof, not just of victory, but of transformation. He wasn't an enemy anymore, he was an object. And when they were done, the ship didn't throw him overboard. It brought him home. The ship creaked into harbor with sails half furled and hull heavy with plunder. But what it carried most visibly was not treasure, it was proof. The chieftain disembarked barefoot, clothing thrown over his shoulders like an afterthought. The village watched without gathering. No shouts, no welcome, just stillness. They didn't need to be told what had happened. They read it in his posture, in the way his eyes never lifted, in the way he stood, body intact, soul missing. His people didn't speak to him, they watched, and that was worse. He tried to resume his place, to speak in council, to direct repairs. But silence met his voice like stone. He had not died in battle, he had returned in shame. The Vikings had made him a living sigil, an emblem carved in bone and gaze, a walking cautionary tale. The others who had been taken with him bore similar marks, no visible wounds. But their bodies moved differently now, measured, careful, as though any sudden motion might shatter what was left of them. Their presence in the village wasn't defiance, it was warning. No one touched them, not out of disgust, but out of fear, because what had happened to them was contagious in myth, even if not in flesh. The gods might walk between forms without punishment, but men who crossed that boundary came back hollowed, and the hollowness frightened people more than the violence. The chieftain no longer sat at feasts. His seat was left empty, not out of cruelty, but because to fill it would demand forgetting what everyone had seen. And forgetting was not allowed. The Vikings understood this. That was the point. The raid had not ended at sea. It continued in silence, in glances, in the absence where leadership used to live. They hadn't just looted a village, they had rewritten it. And now the man who once led it moved through the center like a shadow at noon, visible, undeniable, and utterly untouchable. In smoky corners of longhouses, skalds still sang of Odin, of robes woven for women draped across the All-Father's shoulders, of spells whispered in the rhythms of Seda, a magic feared, feminized, and divine. Odin knelt in sacred circles, his fingers tracing runes into ash and dirt, his body still, receptive, surrendered. And the people nodded, revered him, feared him, worshipped him. But they did not imitate him, because Odin could cross the line and remain a god. Mortals could not. The same posture that elevated Odin would destroy a man. If he knelt, if he softened, if he opened to spirits or men, he was no longer himself. He was ergi, tainted, altered, and the change was permanent. Gods weren't bound by the codes they authored, men were crucified by them. Seda required surrender, intuition, passivity, qualities condemned in mortal men and consecrated in gods. Odin's authority absorbed the contradiction, his power made the feminine sacred. But when human hands reached for that same power, the system responded with exile, ridicule, silence, or worse. A farmer caught practicing Seda faced not awe, but expulsion. A warrior caught kneeling in the wrong context didn't face gods, He faced stone and rope and cold steel. Divinity offered vision, not permission. Mortals were meant to admire, not follow. The gods' freedom served a purpose, not to inspire, but to contain. They demonstrated possibilities that men must learn, not to attempt. So the gods became mirrors that burned when touched. Odin's rituals remained sacred. But the man who tried to replicate them, he disappeared. The gods fell, the cross rose, but the machinery remained. As Christianity swept through the north, on the tongues of kings, in the hands of priests, the sagas faded into scripture, and blood feuds were traded for confession. But the core didn't shift. It adapted. The church didn't dismantle the Viking obsession with masculine purity. It refined it. Where Norse law had punished shame with steel, Christian doctrine punished it with eternity. Arger became sodomite. Urge became abomination. Nid became unnatural. The vocabulary changed. The sentence deepened. A man once accused of softness could draw a sword. Now he could only kneel. The monastery floor was cold stone. The accused knelt with spine straight again. But this time not for combat, for correction. Monks circled him in silence. A whip cracked, methodical, not with rage, but with purpose. Each lash a theology carved into flesh. Pain became language. Blood became gospel. This wasn't punishment, it was purification. Under the old system, submission marked you as less than a man. Under the new one, it marked you as a threat to the soul itself. The stakes had moved from village banishment to divine judgment. The system had expanded, vertical now, stretching from hearth to heaven. The man cried out, but not for mercy. There was none. Just ritual, just discipline, just redemption if you bled correctly. Outside, the bells rang the hour. Inside, time was measured by pain. Each stripe was a scar meant to outlive the body. A reminder that the architecture of masculinity had not been dismantled. It had found a new cathedral. And the altar was the same man's back. The monastery returned to silence. The whip was hung. The floor was washed. The man was left with wounds that would scar and lessons that would not. But nothing had been cleansed. Not really. The church had done what the old law never could. Universalized the fear. Under Viking rule, shame clung to the passive. Under Christian rule, shame clung to everyone. No hierarchy, just guilt. Comprehensive, eternal. The logic stayed the same: to receive, to yield, to soften. These were still crimes. But now they were not violations of honor. They were violations of creation, of God's plan. The new system had no need for public stones or whispered insults. It had confession, surveillance, internalization. You policed yourself now. The whip no longer had to chase you. You carried it inside your ribs. The monks didn't need to watch. You watched yourself. What had once required accusation now required only imagination. The words changed like masks. Urge, sodomite, deviant, disordered. But the target stayed still. The body that knelt, that opened, that failed to dominate, it remained. And the system's brilliance lay not in its brutality, but in its invisibility. The accused left the monastery not with chains, but with permission to walk freely, as long as he never forgot what had been carved into his back. His pain wasn't exile. It was evidence. He had learned. He would not cross the line again. Not publicly, not visibly. And that was enough. The cross rose above the hills. The architecture had changed. The message had not. You were still being taught what it meant to be a man, and who would be destroyed for failing to remain one. Centuries turned. Gods were buried beneath cathedrals. Churches crumbled into monuments. But the system endured, not as religion, not as law, but as reflex. It no longer needed whips. Now it used jokes. It used silence. It used the absence of touch, the mockery in a glance, the discomfort in a son's slouched posture. The shame once carved in stone now echoed in locker rooms, in playgrounds, in boardrooms and bedrooms. No decree was needed, only repetition. What had begun in blood now moved through language like inheritance. The terms changed again: faggot, weak, beta, simp. New words, same verdict. Modern slurs carried ancient DNA. The man who failed to dominate still bore the sentence of the sword in. Not by law, by instinct, culture, habit. The punishment wasn't exile now, it was invisibility. Social death without ceremony. A man could marry, lead, vote, preach, but if he moved wrong, sat wrong, loved wrong, cried wrong, he became something else. Not fully erased, just permanently dimmed. A presence always slightly too much or not enough. And no one remembered where the rules had come from. They didn't need to. They had been taught through the body, taught through generations of fathers flinching at softness, through priests replacing shame with guilt, through schools mocking gentleness, through medicine pathologizing divergence, through history that never really passed. Now the system hid behind tolerance. It smiled while it cut. It offered protections while keeping the target marked. The old rune stones had vanished, but the wounds they named still hadn't closed, because the system had never needed permanence. It had only needed memory. History didn't bury this system. It built around it. Stone tablets gave way to scrolls, then to printed laws, then diagnostic manuals, then digital platforms. Each new surface carried the same blueprint: define the boundary, mark the violator, enforce the consequence. Gods once punished the man who crossed the line. Now the algorithm does. The words sound different, the violence doesn't. A man softens his voice, a boy paints his nails. A father weeps too openly. None are exiled, none are whipped. But something in the room shifts. The laughter pauses. The conversation edits itself mid-sentence. A joke appears. A silence follows. And the old machine, now dressed in modern skin, records another successful function. You don't need law to destroy someone. You just need culture. You just need the 1,000 invisible cuts that make certain kinds of men vanish without ever being told they must. There's no trial, no accusation, just the slow erosion of space, of respect, of voice. And still, the myths remain. The gods who shifted genders live on in story, beautiful, free, safe from consequence, but they were never meant to liberate. They were meant to warn. Look, they said, but don't touch. Worship, but never imitate. The divine could cross the line, the mortal could only shatter on it. This system didn't survive because of belief. It survived because it learned not to ask for belief. Only silence, only performance, only the unspoken knowledge that to receive, to yield, to be open, is to risk everything. And that is why, even now, the architecture stands. Not in temples, not in law, but in posture, in glance, in fear that has no beginning and no visible source. This wasn't history. This is the present. Still operating, still watching, still waiting for someone to try and step across the line and be broken for it.